Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Allison Pugh, Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Allison writes on how people forge connections and find meaning and dignity at work and at home. In her latest book, The Last Human Job, The Work of Connecting in a Disconnected World, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2024, she builds a compelling case for the preservation of human work in an increasingly automated and mechanical world. On April 17th, 2025, Allison Pugh will deliver the OHC's annual Cressman Lecture, Reimagining the Other, Ourselves, Finding the Human in the Age of AI. This talk is part of the Oregon Humanities Center's 2024-25 themed speaker series on the topic of reimagine. Thanks for coming on the show. This is such a timely moment to consider some of your topics, automation, efficiency, the values and needs of human persons. So I'm just so pleased that you'll be delivering the Cressman Lecture.
Thanks so much for having me.
I thought we might open by asking you a bit about your background and what led to your work in sociology.
Sure. My background, I took a very circuitous route to being a professor. Probably worked in 8 to 10 different jobs in my 20s. And how I got to sociology is it was can we say love at first sight? It took me probably 10 years to get to Berkeley, but once I was there, I was immersed in just an incredible environment of intellectual foment, and also being really kind of deeply seen by my mentors there. So it was a heady time, and one I will not ever forget. I owe a lot to that moment in time. And how I got to this project was I do kind of think this is the project I probably should have done for my dissertation. Like it captures exactly what I care about on a really deep level. But I kind of found my way there almost sidelong when I wrote a piece defending in-depth interviewing, which is a practice how I conduct much of my research. This is my 4th book, so the other 3 were a lot of in-depth interviews, and kind of thinking deeply about what is the exchange that happens in the moment of an in-depth interview over a couple of hours where you're sitting with someone just trying to really understand their truth. I'm thinking, what is that? What's happening with us, and how is it similar to other things? Led me to this project.
That's such a wonderful formulation. Yes, it gives me lots to think about, and I think we'll come back to it later in the interview. But just now, I'm also just interested. You mentioned defending long form interviews, and that leads me to the question of, what kinds of research did you do as you prepared this book?
Yeah, maybe it took me probably 5 years, something like that, 5 years of research. I started in 2015, really, and it involved in-depth interviews with practitioners of this thing that I was interested in, this seeing the other. It was really a kind of it was a journey, I would say. It was not kind of maybe a typical sociology project where you're like, I'm going to interview this many people and they'll be stratified in this way and I'll find them in this way. It was more of a journey of discovery, an odyssey. And yeah, I started out, as I say, I was interested in this in-depth interview and what else is it like. And if you ever do in-depth interviews, you realize at the end, they often say, that was just like therapy. So the notion, the kind of work that you do where you're like deeply seeing the other, reflecting their truths, correcting that sight when it's not quite right, like listening to the other as they say, no, that's not right. It's more like this. And you're like, oh, I see. How about this? It's a real interactive dance. And so I decided to kind of follow that where it happened beyond just, sociology research. And I found it everywhere. So then, I found it in, my kid's soccer coach. I found it in my neighbor who is a minister. I found it in, so I started, okay, I need to be more systematic about this. So I decided to do, here's where my sociology self kicks in. I did 3 major groups. So I looked at therapists, teachers, and primary care physicians. And then I was a little worried that all of those people were kind of professional degree people. So I said, I want to also include those who don't have higher, advanced degrees. So then I actually talked to sex workers and I talked to home healthcare aides and I talked to funeral directors and a wide variety of others. And then in addition, I also wanted to kind of see it in action. So I also had a very strong, what they call ethnographic component to it, where I probably watched some north of 300 hours of many of these practitioners doing their work. And that included, 6 months in an HIV clinic, watching the practitioners, the primary care physicians there, as well as the nurse practitioners and the community health workers, et cetera, working with patients and what happened in that moment of what happens in the clinical moment. And then of course I was really interested in seeing therapy in action, but that's a little harder. So instead, what I did was I looked at how it was trained, which often involves kind of videoed sessions with people with therapists who then are kind of given feedback by their supervisors. That's how they do that. And I was particularly interested in training. Actually, training was really often how the kind of way I looked for training moments when I was looking for observing moments, because I was particularly interested, like the animating kind of problem the animating kind of issue or tension that I was pursuing in this whole project was not just discovering this witnessing work and finding it everywhere. That was one part, but also capturing and chasing down the tension between that kind of idiosyncratic, very personal, very emotional connection, and then the tension between that and kind of how do we systematize that work? And training is a perfect example. Like, how do you figure out what's a general principle to derive and then offer to your students? And I do that when I train people how to do interviews. It's like I do this kind of intensely personal work. So how do what are the general principles of that abstracting out is the very process that underlies, algorithmic practice by engineers. So I was really interested in the application of systems to this very personal work.
Yes, I was struck in one point. I think it's maybe even in the introduction to The Last Human Job, and you say that when you were first starting out on this project, you found a good deal of community with researchers who were developing AI, that, each of you were attuned to this question, although perhaps what you saw there went in different directions.
Yeah.
Can you explain? It seems that one of the core um, interests and topics in your book is connective labor. Could you just explain a little bit about connective labor?
Sure. That's this witnessing work that I've been talking about. And I do think I'm one of those who believes in giving something a name uh, because we cannot really talk about it unless we have a name for something, I think. So once I realized that that's what all these, what underlies so much of this work, I started to really focus in on this witnessing labor. And so, in my view, witnessing labor or connective labor is when you see the other and the other feels seen. And that happens through a kind of, reflective listening, what therapists might call attunement. And also, it involves some what Arlie Hochschild called emotional labor. So you're not like kind of spilling all out, all of your feelings out. You're actually controlling your feelings as you see the other effectively. And yeah, it has to be received by the other. It's definitely interactive. That is a crucial component about it. The thing that really distinguishes it from many other phrases that are out there, which are really focusing on the individual skill, individual trait, emotional intelligence, etc. This is a kind of really deeply interactive thing, which is why I'm calling it connective labor.
Mhm. Now, no, I agree with you. I think it's really interesting, and I appreciated the distinction you drew in the book between emotional intelligence, which has that little sort of nuance of some kind of natural born trait, whereas
Mhm.
connective labor is something that can be learned in practice and needs to be acknowledged.
Yes.
An example I appreciated in your book that I think helps bring some of the questions that you're working with home is the example of the chaplain in the
hmm
hospital. Would you be willing to
hmm
just talk about that for a second? I think,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, it's, I felt so lucky doing the research for this book. There was so much, I felt so privileged to be able to witness these people, these experts at seeing the other in their work. It was incredible opportunity, you know, throughout this time. The chaplain, Erin, is a perfect example of that because I followed her around like a, shadow as she's going through the hospital and watching how she's connecting to others who are quite distant from her in her background. She's like this kind older white lady with chunky jewelry and a really earnest manner, and she's connecting with disadvantaged patients, either people of color who just received a terminal diagnosis, and she's holding their hands and managing somehow through her effective witnessing and kind of deploying of kind of common symbols or common culture, she's able to kind of get past their suspicion of her and offer real solace. So it was such a privilege to watch her do her work. I watched her sing with patients. I watched her hold their hands. She prayed with them. These are patients in the worst moments of their lives. So the part that I use to open the book about Erin, the one that kind of really, I think, summarizes the connective labor that I want to talk about in the book, is her interaction with a man I call Hiram, in which he is intubated and can't speak, and is also furious about being intubated and can't write because he's on medication. And so he's without the capacity to express all the fury inside him. And she looks at him and she sees that. And she thinks, okay, what I imagine she thinks what he needs is to be able to express that. So she goes to him and she says, take this Kleenex box and throw it against the wall. And in response, he like kind of pulls her in and she sits with him for 15 minutes. And the next day or a couple of days later, he sees her and he says, there is nothing like being seen when you're at the worst moment of your life by someone you don't even know. And he's profoundly affected by what she did in this kind of, yeah, I want to say casual, but actually it's very intentional way of doing her work. That's the power of connective labor, the magic of it, and the actual practice. Yeah.
I had forgotten because I read this piece of your book a little while ago, but I had forgotten that she was the person who also said to him, throw the Kleenex box, because I think I have this right. But the other moment that I really saw in that example that you used was that she was doing this rich, important witnessing and interpersonal labor. And then she had to annotate it sort of task by task on charts, right? And to me, I thought, right. I
Yes.
mean, that is the paradox of the present moment in living
Yes.
color. Could you just tell us about that too?
Exactly. I mean, that is the story of our time. So yes, she has this incredible capacity to reach the other through seeing them. And at the same time, Erin had to fill out three different kind of data portals. She had to upload, she had to fill out a series of prompts in the Epic electronic health record that's quite standard for doctors and nurses in hospitals. She had two other basically spreadsheets that she had to fill out where she had to kind of, you know, summarize somehow, find proxies for like what she was doing, which was this deeply connective, labor with another human being. And she has to be like, and I'm watching her like peck at the computer, going like, and she's narrating to me. She's like, family is a resource, and she's using a cheat sheet so she can figure out, what counts. And it actually is kind of worse than that, or more consequential than that. She has to like not all the computers work. So where she goes in the hospital is in part determined by how good the computers are there. She's like always talking to nurses. Sometimes the computer's freezing and she's having to like redo it all. It's adding to her day. And no one is billed for her work. No one is billed for the chaplain. So why are we asking her to keep data on it? It was a puzzle that animated the whole book, really.
Yeah, it's very powerful. And that sort of reflecting on that and also thinking about your work, I was compelled then when I heard you say later, I think in an interview, that these kinds of moments indicate why it is that mechanization and automation would seem to fill a function. I mean, if they can take care of that task, then that seems valuable, right? But you also talk about a downside. So you see the ups and the downs.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's nicely put because it's like, why are we like, it's almost like the automation or AI is solving a problem that we've given ourselves that might be solved another way. And so it's just kind of funny to step back, or important to step back and be like, well, why is this a problem that needs mechanization to solve in the first place? And that's actually true among, kind of every time now, every time I hear some kind of engineer or, technologist argue that AI solves a particular problem, I find myself stepping back and go, why is that a problem in the first place? Is it a problem? And then the second thing is, how have we ended up here, and is there a kind of preceding step that we could take rather than mechanize at the end? The AI scribe is actually, uh, I think it's coming. It's actually in practice right now in several I know it's in practice in several kind of influential national clinics. I know Kaiser is doing a major study of thousands of physicians. So this is the near future. I would say the present to near future of, AI solving the problem of data entry for these people. And that is a real problem. But yes, is it one we've given ourselves?
Yes, I mean, as you said earlier, why collect all that data, right? On three different spreadsheets. And I mean, there can be answers, but there can also be, well, actually, we don't. Let's rethink that.
Yeah. I mean, I am a sociologist. I do believe in data. And I'm always extrapolating across different occupations. So, for example, what the chaplain faces, the teacher faces, the physician faces, et cetera. So, in all of these cases, we're asking the very people who do this connective work to also enter the data. And that does feel like a problem. And so, is the question, get rid of all data? Well, in an era in which a lot of the surveys that researchers are rely on are being eradicated at the national level, I can feel the preciousness of data actually, but I do think we've kind of let the mania for data drive the bus, basically, and instead of being more parsimonious about what is actually worth knowing and what is helpful. So we've enabled kind of fishing expeditions and put all of that burden on the people who are actually doing the feeling work. Yeah. So I think we can adjust, but I don't think I would say get rid of it entirely.
No, I'm really glad you made that point. And yes, I think we're in a moment where we are witnessing perhaps value of data in ways that we didn't see it as clearly before. I think that's such an important point.
Mm.
Maybe it's more about continuing to witness and value and recognize the significance of the human dimension, right?
Yeah. And letting that be the most important thing rather than, I don't know, other things you want to know. Like, if you want to know those things, find them in places other than the relationship, basically, and really prioritize the human to human connection. That's my personal goal with this work, and what I see not happening in so many ways in which kind of the data imperative audit culture, et cetera, has been really implemented to date.
So, what are some ideas you have about this last point that you just made? How can we ensure that connective labor remains human labor, and how can we encourage people in our society to recognize its value?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote this whole book about it, and you'd think I'd have that all sorted, but I think I am continually thinking about that and struggling with that. I mean, on the one hand, as I've been giving talks around the country and in Europe, uh, people are committed and worried about this. And there is an army of people who do this work out there who are, I mean, they write me emails, like they are um, really yearning to be recognized for this work, yearning for this work to be valued. So there's hope there. Um, but when you talk, I also talk to, I would say, kind of techno optimists. And um, I just gave a talk on Tuesday at MIT, for example, and they were like, kind of really insisting on me facing or finding the positive use case, as they would say.
Hmm.
And people do send me things, like so I know, for example, that at Brigham and Women's, a hospital in Boston, they are actually doing work to analyze where connective labor is happening in the hospital. And they're doing that kind of by using AI and assessing duration and tone and kind of not necessarily content because they're very worried about, confidentiality, but uh, other ways to get to kind of closeness between a practitioner, a clinician, and a patient. And I think that's a good I think that's a good project. We want to know where it's happening. First of all, I think we want to know where it's happening because we've been making changes without knowing where it's happening. Like orderlies, for example, sometimes they'll shave a patient, and that's going to be a deeply intimate moment where they're definitely going to be talking to each other. You're not just going to be like, okay, flip over, or whatever. You're actually, and that's probably, I'm guessing, there's going to be some connective labor there. And so I think often the idea is like, oh, we'll just automate many of these, maybe not shaving, but certainly the other tasks that an orderly might do. And yeah, I want to know where it happens. And I think that information would be helpful in protecting and preserving it, especially if it surprises us about where it happens. So you ask kind of what's the way forward? And I would say one way is I want us to kind of pay attention to it. One way forward is, I think, give it a name. I actually am relaxed if everyone calls it connective labor or something totally different, but I want us to talk about it. So that's the first thing, is like pay attention to it. And the second thing is make that the imperative, like make that the priority. So as we were saying about like, where do you insert data analytics? Well, just don't make it ruin the connection. That seems like a very basic thing, but it hasn't been what we've been doing to date. So that would be the second thing. And then when we're thinking about kind of future technology, yeah, I mean, there's many different iterations and many different debates here that we could get into. But if you have a connection criterion, is what I've been thinking about it, like where, this Brigham and Women's thing, that doesn't feel right now like it's being used to impede. So that is something that seems like a positive step. But I'm quite cautious because, of course, as soon as you put a number on something, then people try and game that, or employers try to make it more efficient, or like there's going to be things that could be corrosive, and I'm certainly aware of those dangers.
Yes, we're running out of time, and yet I just, your example of the orderly also helped me remember how important some of the work in your book on social class and privilege and race is, as those, conditions affect what gets seen and what doesn't get seen. I wonder if you could just say a few more words on that.
Yeah, that's really crucial and a kind of thorny problem, and also a place of great hope, ironically, or I don't know what. We don't see each other partially because of stereotyping and bias that come into play with regard, that kind of insert themselves when we are separated by inequality and identities. But also, and this was something that is important to realize, it is also true that there's something to connective labor. The power of connective labor in part rests on the fact that you value the other person's opinion. And so in that is some form of inequality, often, not always. And I'm really kind of wrestle with this because, we don't want, there's so much misrecognition and there's so much harm that comes when someone is not seen by a professional, say, that they went to for that purpose. Like that is really detrimental and deeply problematic. But I also know that many of the professionals that I was talking to, or the workers that I was talking to, said, they seem hungry for my seeing my ability to see them, and it's like they want me and not not their neighbor or their sister or whatever. They're coming to me for a reason. And I really sat with that and thought about the risk. Part of the power of being seen is the risk of someone else's judgment. You don't actually want negative judgment, but the power of it comes from the risk of that judgment. And I started to think, I might write a book someday, or I started to think of it as no friction, no fire. You need the risk to make it more powerful, but also that's also more scary. That's also more threatening. And that there's so much to say about that, but that I think captures something about both the kind of solace that connective labor provides, and also the profound impact that it can offer, and the anguish when it's done wrong. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I've been speaking with Allison Pugh, author of The Last Human Job, The Work of Connecting in a Disconnected World. She will give a lecture titled Reimagining the Other, Ourselves, Finding the Human in the Age of AI as the 2024-25 Cressman Lecturer. Her talk is part of the Oregon Humanities Center's 2024-25 themed speaker series on the topic of reimagine. Our Research Notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student research. In this episode, Melissa Graboyes tells us about how she involves students in her global health research group. Recently, 2 students accompanied her to explore the Rockefeller archives in search of malaria history. A historian of modern Africa and global health, Melissa is an associate professor of history at the University of Oregon. She's also past director of UO's African Studies program and one of the co-founders of the UO's Global Health program. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
How would you describe your research focus? And I guess we're especially interested today in hearing about how you involve UO students in your research.
Yeah. So I really think about my research as being pretty rooted on the African continent, and particularly East Africa, and interested in issues of global health and history and ethics. So how can we think about a historical lens on questions that have ongoing relevance today? And sometimes that means I work with students and community partners here in Eugene. I've done a series of papers about people who inject drugs, working with local community organizations. But mostly I think about the African continent and how I can get involved there about pressing issues, and thinking about how can I make space in my research for undergraduate students, particularly, to be exposed to what history-based humanities, social science research is all about.
And then what is the Global Health Research Group?
So the Global Health Research Group has been operating for almost 8 years now, and we welcome about 15 to 20 students for an intensive multi-year mentoring program that's I lead, in addition to support with a graduate student who co-leads with me. And students apply into the group because they have some sort of interest in global health research, some sort of interest on the African continent, some sort of interest in social science humanities research. And many of these students are actually pursuing degrees in the natural sciences and see themselves as future medical doctors. And what I offer them is a kind of deeper dive into thinking about the humanities approaches to these topics, and why it's important to think about the history of the fields that they're working in, the history of science, and thinking about the ethical practices of whatever medical global health work it is that they want to do, either domestically here in the United States or internationally. And so when students join the group, they often come in at the end of their freshman year or sophomore year, and that's purposeful so they can be with me and the rest of the group members for 3 and sometimes 4 years when we have super seniors or graduate students there. And it's just this amazing group that the students become great peers. They become peer supports for each other. They become peer educators for each other about resources and volunteer opportunities and internships, and think with each other and circulate conference drafts and talk about research. And I really think that sometimes they learn as much from each other as they learn from me in the sessions and the guest speakers that I bring in, because it's a really just thoughtful, ambitious, curious group of students that I feel really, it's one of the real pleasures of my job to get to work with them. And the group was funded for 6 years with an NSF career grant, where the primary focus was undergraduate mentoring. And my key demographic was female identifying students who are STEM majors, but are interested in building in this more humanistic approach to thinking about their future careers. And I think our group has been extremely successful in bringing a layer of complexity into many science students thinking about their research topics. The group is also a springboard for those who are more interested to work with me in a paid capacity as research assistants, and for many of the students in the group to actually become co-authors with me on papers. And for those students who work in paid RA capacities, or come on as papers and as co-authors, we often get to do field work together, which involves visiting archives in the United States or internationally, or doing field work internationally. And of course, not all 15 students do this with me every year, but a handful of students. I think we've had 8 to 10 students over the last 6 or 7 years who have been able to travel with me and do firsthand historical archival work, which is just an amazing way to open their field and field of reference and frame of reference about what it means to do humanistic research.
Something I'm reflecting on as I'm listening to you talk about this fantastic and innovative project is how often in academic contexts we hold career readiness as somehow separate from our research mission and pedagogy. And yet what you're describing is such an amazing opportunity for students to learn what it might be like to be a career researcher.
I think it's so satisfying on so many levels, and I think it ticks so many boxes that I wish more humanistic faculty members would think about involving undergraduates in their research, because I know the barrier seems high. It seems like there's a lot of things that aren't clear, and especially for disciplines where sole authorship is the norm versus working in teams and co-authoring. I think that there's such great reinforcement between mentoring for the student, actual research productivity on the faculty member side, career preparedness, and teaching also, that a lot of my students come out of my classes and I teach about my research, and I have my students who are my RAs come into my class to talk about this role of what did they gain from undergraduate research. And it takes a lot of energy as a faculty member to set this up, but I think the dividends are actually quite large. And I would go so far to argue that my research is better because of my students' involvement in it, and that it's more thoughtful, it's more iterative, I have to explain things, and that it's not a zero-sum game of by involving students in my research, it degrades the quality. I actually think it's quite the opposite.
No, I agree with you. I think so many of us find that also in our seminars, that it's those conversations across different sort of academic generations that lead to these wonderful ideas. And then, of course, the other piece that you mentioned that's on everybody's mind right now, which is how important this funding is to keep that present and active.
The funding is critical, and I have to say that I had started the research group without a clear idea of the shape of it before I got my NSF career grant, but it couldn't have functioned to this degree. We've served over 60 students, many of them underrepresented in their STEM field, in addition to being female identifying. And exposed them to humanistic research, and really added something very important to their science education by bringing them in contact with the liberal arts on a regular basis. And that couldn't have happened without significant support from NSF and this career award for early career researchers. And those awards, I mean, it's small peanuts in the grand scheme of things, but $400,000 award over 5 or 6 years allows you to lay a trajectory for thoughtful student engagement, where you're not running to get $5,000 or $2,000 every single term, you can actually devote that energy to student involvement and setting up a structure to really support them over time.
Absolutely. So I think this is evident in much of what you've been saying, but the third question we ask in these segments is always, what makes the work you do with the Global Health Research Group important to humanity?
Well, I think that it's important in a few ways. One, I would say that the research group challenges my own thinking. They are smart students who come from very different backgrounds, and we engage in a series of thoughtful topics each term. So this term, our question for the research group is, what does it mean to do engaged research in this current political, financial, fiscal climate for higher education? What are our obligations as thoughtful, ethical researchers to our communities, to our participants, to be engaged politically, perhaps? And so I think it's important because I think it creates better scholarship, one. Two, I think it's really important to offer talented, motivated undergraduates space to be involved in humanities research so that the perception is, well, it's easy to do research if you join a lab because labs have this structure to scientific labs, natural science labs, chemistry labs, human phys labs, because they have this structure and this pecking order and this hierarchy. And undergraduates can come in and they learn from other students and they learn from grad students and postdocs, and the PI is there at the top. And I don't think enough humanists and social scientists think about adopting that lab structure to serve them and serve the topics that are important to the humanities. And that is important to students. And then the third is, I think that the direct exposure to research. So back in September 2024, I took 2 students to the Rockefeller Foundation Archive in upstate New York, and we spent 5 days there looking at materials related to the history of malaria in Africa. It seemed like it was going to be kind of a dud of a trip. We weren't finding very much, and the students were a little discouraged. And I said, well, this happens. Sometimes you go to an archive and you don't find things. And on the second to the last day, we found something. And I talked to the students and I said, oh, I know we have a paper. I know exactly what this is. This is what it's going to be built on. This is what you're going to look at. This is what you're going to look at. We're going to pull it all together. And the students did it, and it was so energizing. And that draft paper I presented at the University of Basel just a few weeks ago. The students are listed as co-authors on it. I got to show them the slides. We had this back and forth about how does new knowledge get produced in history. So we went from the archive, we drafted a paper, we take it to a seminar, we get feedback, we revise again. What does it mean to submit and go through peer review? So exposing students firsthand to the creation of new humanistic knowledge not only creates this pathway for them to do it, but also opens up, again, their horizons of what they can do. So an econ student recently went with me to the WHO archive, and she had never been in an archive before, and she's applying to PhD programs. And at the end of 5 days, she said, I really liked this. I've never done this before. I've never taken a history class, but if this is what it means to be a historian, I want to do this. And she said, when I apply to PhD programs, again, I will apply thinking about economic history and who I can work with. So I think it's just the exposure is so important for students to think about integrating the humanities into their interests that they already have.
Yes, and then especially, when your interest is something as wide-ranging and wide-reaching as global health, also, I think to bring that ethical dimension is just so important and exciting. And
yeah, I mean, there's so much space to talk about it, both in terms of current events and what's going on with USAID shutting down and grants being cut globally and domestically. But I still think that even teaching about these topics, I'm teaching a class on on the history and ethics of global health right now, and it's populated. There's 50 students, and not a single one of them is a history student. And I think that it's amazing because the discussion, I'm teaching them how to think historically and why is that approach important for talking about global health, but they're offering very different perspectives as a starting place when we come together in the classroom.
well, thank you so much for telling us about your project. Where can we learn more about these issues that you've been talking about today?
I have my website, which is my first and last name, melissagraboyes.com, and it has information about the Global Health Research Group. It has information about ongoing research projects that I'm working on that are all collaborative and have students. That's probably the best place. And for students who might listen to this and are interested in working with me, come see me. I love talking to students. Come to my office hours, send me an email. That's how some of my best research assistants and co-authors have been found.
Thank you. I've been speaking with Melissa Graboyes, historian of modern Africa and global health at the University of Oregon. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.